So some pretty high-level stuff there from Jordan Peterson in his opening address at the ARC conference in London this week. But what does that all mean for us mere mortals, and what does it mean for Australia? Dr. Stephen Chavura is one of Australia's leading historians and a lecturer at Campion College in Sydney. I had the great pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Chavura for a discussion on how all of this affects Australia at ARC this week. I hope you enjoy this first part.
Great finally to be on your show, Damien.
Good to have you.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the show.
Thank you. Appreciate that. How's ARC been for you so far, just in general terms?
Look, I've been having a great time. The talks have been stimulating. They've been interesting. Getting to meet people who I've read their books, I've seen them online, but I've never actually met them. So it's actually great. One of the things I love doing is going up to someone who wrote a great book, who wrote a courageous book or said something courageous, and going up and just thanking them.
Now, the US has got Trump. The UK has Reform, this new political party under Nigel Farage, which is outpolling, I think, in some polls, the Conservative Party now.
Yes.
Australia doesn't have... What's missing for us? Is it our system? What's your take on that?
It's probably a few things. I think that there's in a way, Australia just doesn't have the issues as badly as America and England does. So we've got immigration issues in Australia, but for example, our mass Islamic immigration issue has not gotten anywhere near as bad as what it has in England, for example. And so that means any movement that's going to try and get a lot of traction on that issue in Australia is going to really, really struggle. Whereas they're doing much better in England because it's a much bigger problem. And it's probably also the idea that, in Australia, the ultimate, the strongest power is held by parties. And, so we're never going to have a Trump figure who can just come in and do things like that. Although I will say, I was thinking about this the other day. Someone once asked me, could we have a Trump in Australia? And this is what I sort of have come to believe. It is that if we ever had one, and this is going to sound really strange, it was Gough Whitlam. Because Gough Whitlam comes in 1972 and just says, I don't like all these laws. And he and his deputy PM, Lance Barnard, form a sort of a duumvirate over 2 weeks. They take all the portfolios on themselves. And just like Trump is passing all these executive orders day after day after day, that's what Gough Whitlam and Lance Barnard did. They just passed all these new laws and did all these things, which ultimately, even though their government crashed 3 years later, they changed Australia permanently. And so the weird thing is, if we could ever have a Trump, it was someone like Gough Whitlam. And part of me kind of says, something, maybe we need a sort of conservative Gough Whitlam government that isn't concerned so much about staying in power, but it's concerned about fixing the rot in the time that they have.
Yeah, so, if you put my MBA hat on for a minute, we would call that breakthrough change instead of incremental change. And organisations need that sometimes to really shake things up. And I think that's what a lot of commentators are missing about what Trump is doing and what Musk is helping him do.
Completely.
And we do need that, I think, in Australia because the bureaucracy has become so large.
Well, the bureaucracy has become an unelected kingdom within a kingdom. And you have the same thing in England as well. So, what happens in England when the English convincingly vote to exit Europe for breakfast? Brexit. I'm hungry. I missed lunch. That's why I said that. Yeah. Well, they find that at every point they have to face hurdles put up by the English public service. And that's why it was such a painful, drawn-out process, because the English public service was basically throwing every roadblock in front. And you've got similar things in Australia. That's one of the reasons the immigration system in Australia has been so hard to reform, because the federal bureaucracy has made it very, very difficult. It's the same thing going on in America. Trump calls it the deep state. The deep state is not a conspiracy theory.
No, it's just a bureaucracy.
It's a bureaucracy that is unelected, that knows more than any individual politician. And so individual politicians find themselves enthralled by the collective knowledge of the bureaucracy. Which makes it very difficult for them to do anything.
I was just talking to former Queensland Premier Campbell Newman, who's here also, about his time in power. Exactly that happened to him because he went in to do breakthrough change, he tried to reform, and then the machine just went against him. And of course, they convinced the public that he was completely evil when he wasn't, and that stuck, for a very long time. His own party, in fact, kind of abandoned him, I think, to a large extent.
That's pretty sad. And just one thing we haven't mentioned is that the bureaucracy in England, in America, in Australia, it's left-wing.
Yes.
They're all creatures of the university system. They're creatures of the left-wing establishment institutions. And that is the big problem.
On top of the fact that by a bureaucracy's very nature, it's going to want to feed itself and grow itself in self-interest. Stephen, you're a deeper man than all of this. I want to get to some of the themes, the big themes, particularly Jordan Peterson's speech at the opening when he talked about sacrifice. Seemed to be a dominant theme there. Hedonism as being part of our culture now, that being an expression of immaturity, but we seem to have a lot of child adults running around in the West at the moment. Are we in they talk about the civilizational moment here at ARC. That seems to be the phrase. What does that phrase mean to you? What do those themes mean to you generally? Or how would you perhaps put that into an Australian context for us?
Yeah, well, I mean, Australia is an offshoot of British civilization. And, Australia is an incredible success story of people who came here against all the odds and built something really remarkable. It was a risk coming here. They nearly starved in the first 18 months when the Australian pioneers came here. They nearly starved to death. I don't want to sound like Trump talking about the Haitian immigrants, but they were literally eating dogs. They were eating rats. It's in the historical records. And so they had a pretty tough time, but they wound up building something through much blood, sweat, and tears, and it's an amazing success story. But they did this because they believed in something, and it's not even just that they believed in themselves. There was this belief, and it lasts right up until Federation, that there is a sense in which this project that they were working on, which would become Australia, was something that was part of God's plan for history. They really thought that they were doing something that was sort of a manifestation of God's hand. They were a part of something so big, so meaningful, that all the pain, the death, the suffering, the risk-taking, it was all worth it. And I think that's what is dying in the West. This sense that what we are about in Australia, what they're about in America, in the West in general, is about something bigger than just us as individuals, something bigger than just the national GDP getting bigger and bigger and our economies growing, but it's something cosmic. It's about this idea that there is a God, and that we are that we have duties not just to ourselves but to God himself, and that is the very meaning of life. It's embodied in Christianity, and that this is worth making sacrifices for. And so there's this debate in ARC. It's been going since the first ARC, and it is, do we need a revival of Christianity for a revival of what is best about Western civilization? Some say, no, we don't. We just need to believe in ourselves, and we just need to remain prosperous and keep our eyes on fundamental freedoms, freedom of speech and things like that. Then there are others, and I'm in this other camp, which say all these other things, like the respect for freedoms, respect for other people's freedoms, other people's rights, they all hinge on a prior commitment to a kind of meaningfulness of all the suffering and trouble and risk-taking that is required to build a civilization and maintain a civilization to begin with. And that meaningfulness is, in the case of Western civilization, Christianity. And Jordan's on that page as well. Jordan Peterson's on that page. I think Neil Ferguson's on that page. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is on that page. And the basic argument is, look, building a country, building a civilization is a very hard, painful process. It relies on a lot of sacrifice. And for people to go through that kind of pain and sacrifice and loss for something that they may not even themselves experience, it may be something for their children or their grandchildren or for people many generations down the track, it has to be meaningful. They won't do it if it's not meaningful. Get rid of all meaning, and yeah, it makes sense. Just live for pleasure, live for the now. But that's not how you build a civilization. And so for a civilization to be built, it requires a belief that this is part of God's plan. And
there does seem to be a bit of a revival occurring in Christianity globally, but particularly in the West, and particularly I've noticed in Australia.
Yes.
It would seem to me that people are searching for meaning. I'm wondering, though, for those viewers that aren't Christian or do not have that sense, and I appreciate what you're saying about the Christian ethic being particularly unique in its nature, in that it does require this sacrifice. It does require a non-hedonistic viewpoint, but also I think paints the narrative more appropriately, or perhaps better again. But for a secular audience, if someone's out there saying, well, look, I'm not into Christianity, what would be the way that they could look at this movement that we need to make and this direction that we need to go in?
What I would actually say to them is, I'm not necessarily going to try and convince you that Christianity is true, but what I would try to point out is that everything that you love about Western civilization, it occurred while Christianity was very strong. Christianity's decline has really happened very fast from the 1960s onwards. So what I would say is basically, you might not appreciate the account of Jesus and the gospel of Christianity, the good news about Jesus Christ. But what you have to appreciate is that the civilization that you want to see restored, it needs it. So even if you don't think you do, and I do think you do, in fact, the civilization does. So I'm not necessarily asking for you to jump on the Christian bandwagon, but understand that your civilization actually does need it. And perhaps actually when you do fully appreciate that your civilization does actually need it, your civilization includes you. And so at that point you might actually look within and start asking yourself, in fact, do I need what Christianity says I need, and that is a savior? And the answer is, yeah, you do. And if you can't believe it on the individual level just yet, at least see how it's true at the macro level, because look what's happening to Western civilization. It's going down the tubes. And when you recognize it on the macro level, come to see the truth of it on the individual level, which is that's a very academic way of saying.
Well,
in fact,
I think it's necessary, because I think it's academia that's been responsible for. I know in my journey, I mean, I've only returned to Christianity in recent years as a result of my exploration of ideas around the left. I didn't realize what was happening to me in the late 1980s as I was being educated in the system, which was very left-wing at that point, and it was almost a crime, almost a sin to mention religion. We scorned it. We saw it as anti-intellectual, as unintelligent. I had, and partly probably that has to do with a fairly inadequate Catholic school education that I had as well. But it was never presented to us at school or at university as having the richness of academic depth and cultural depth and intellectual depth that it does.
That it does have.
Yes. And I think that's the thing we've got to get back to. And if we don't, you're right. I mean, I don't think Western civilization can necessarily survive without some kind of acceptance of at least an allegiance to the Christian ethic.
Exactly. I mean, you can have civilizations without Christianity. We've had them all through history. But probably no one watching wants to live in something like the Carthaginian civilization, where babies are burned to death to satiate a god so the Carthaginians can have good crops and succeed at warfare. When people say they want to see civilization renewed, they're talking about a particular kind of civilization. It's not ancient Greek civilization. It's not ancient Carthaginian civilization. It's not even ancient Roman civilization. Most of us would not want to live in those civilizations. We're talking about a Christianized Western civilization with all sorts of rights and responsibilities and a particular conception of human beings that we've all come to see is the most true, good and beautiful way for a civilization to unfold, and we've all come to enjoy it, but we're seeing it collapse around us.
And that's Professor Stephen Chavura from Campion College in Sydney speaking to me at the ARC conference in London this week. We'll have the second part of that interview a little later in this fortnight show. The other side doesn't get more than $1 billion of taxpayers' money to bring you news from a centre-right perspective like the ABC does to bring you news from a left-wing perspective. In fact, we don't get a red cent from the government. We need voluntary donors and supporters like you to keep going and growing. And we hate asking for charity, so we've done a deal with what we think is the world's best VPN, virtual private network service. It'll keep you and your family truly safe without slowing down your internet speeds, and you can watch Netflix or other streaming services using your regular accounts with them as if you're viewing from any country in the world. And you can sign up for less than $3 a month and get a whopping 83% off the normal price. Just go to piavpn.com/otherside to sign up and get more info. That's piavpn.com/otherside. That was a segment from a recent episode of our fortnightly news commentary show, The Other Side, with me, Damien Curry. If you liked it, support us. Subscribe to our channel on YouTube right now so you don't miss a thing. It's totally free. Just click that subscribe button and the little bell. And check out our Other Side Unplugged show too, and join our mission to actually do something and change Aussie media for the better at othersidetv.com.au. That's othersidetv.com.au. Check it out now.